Hi, I am Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
It was in the early weeks of November, when the fog lays itself like damp wool over the city and the hansoms move as shadows within shadows, that a most singular affair first reached us in Baker Street. The morning had been one of sodden quiet, coal smoke pressed low, the windows filmed with a chill dew, and the fire sending up a thin, grudging heat. Holmes, whose temper is as much sharpened by weather as by want of occupation, had taken to kneeling upon the hearth-rug and playing the violin in an attitude which would have been devotional had it not been accompanied by the most diabolically intricate of passages from a German master. I had been attempting to read a medical pamphlet by the light that he declared good enough for a bat, when there came a hurried foot upon the stair, and, the door flung wide, a small figure entered with the breathless air of one who has outrun his composure. He was a man of perhaps 50, with the raw, knuckled hands and neat, economical dress of a responsible servant. His clerical black was not that of a priest, but of someone attached to ecclesiastical offices. The frock was a trifle shiny at the elbows, and a red thread of wax had hardened along the hem, as if a candle had kissed it in passing. His hat he clutched to his chest, his lips parted, yet sound seemed to stick in his throat. "Mr. Holmes, sir? Dr. Watson?" He managed at last, his voice a rasp half swallowed by the fog. I am Thomas Keene, verger to the Church of St. Jude's in Walsingham Lane." Holmes set the violin upon the mantel with a care that belied his impatience. "You have come still smelling of damp stone and beeswax, Mr. Keene," he said, with that dry civility which falls like a match in kindling. "Pray be seated. You bring us a matter not of doctrine but of silence." The man's eyes widened. "Silence, sir, that's the very word." Holmes's expression did not change. His fingers, long and nervous, steepled themselves. "Watson, you will oblige us with your notebook. Mr. Keene, begin at the beginning, and do not fear to be tedious. The truth often hides in what others omit." "It is our bell, sir," said Keene, after a swallow. "Or rather, it is the thing that happened when the bell did not ring." He turned the hat in his hands. "St. Jude's. She is old. Norman underpinnings, they say. The bell's a great bronze creature from the reign of George II, strikes the hour and summons the parish. At midnight last it was to toll for the repose of Mr. Horatio Pelling, a benefactor, who died 3 days since. The family insisted we keep the bell for the vigil. Mr. Pelling loved the sound, they said, and so I stayed late to see to it. But when the clock came to 12, the hammer fell and nothing, sir, not a breath. A silence like a glove laid over the mouth of the church." Holmes's eyelids lowered. "And you expected, instead of silence, noise?" Sir, we tested it at 11. It answered, proper. But at 12, it was as if the world forgot the note it ought to make. Mr. Pelling's nephew, Mr. Basil Pelling, was there, with his man. A few ladies from the Dorcas Society, 2 constables outside to keep the curious from wandering through the vestry. We all heard the hammer fall, felt it for it shakes the ladders when it does, but the sound never came out. "The bell rope?" said Holmes, "the clapper?" "Both in order, sir, so far as any eye could tell, and I have known that bell 20 years. I ran up to the tower myself, lantern in hand. The clapper hung true, not wedged nor bound. I struck it with the haft of the lantern. It answered a little then, a whisper of a note, but deadened, like a voice through a wall." "And yet you say the greater event was what followed, when the bell did not ring," Holmes observed softly. "Proceed." Keene's gaze drifted to our window, where the fog smeared the street into shapelessness. "Within a minute after the hour there came a cry from below. The crypt stairs, sir. We keep the old Pelling vault under the chancel. The family were at vigil, Mr. Basil and the ladies, and they had gone down to kneel a moment before retiring the mourners to the carriages. I followed at once. There's a chill there that eats to the marrow, and the air smells of old stone and varnish. The candle lanterns made more shadow than light. He paused, and his Adam's apple moved. At the foot of the stairs upon the flags lay Mr. Basil's man, Fowler they call him, mouthed open, eyes staring. Not dead, sir, but struck dumb, and he has not spoken since. His right hand was clenched about a scrap of paper near torn to shreds. Up the right wall of the passage, near where he fell, was a mark in chalk, a circle with 3 short lines like a child's sun, only the lines were not rays, but dashes, each underlined, as if a man had made them in haste and with a poor light. The vault door itself was shut and bolted from without as I had left it, and the key was in my pocket. Yet within we heard a sound. No, sir, not a sound, the absence of it, for there is always a hush there, but last night it was a hush that pressed upon the ear till it ached. "You unlocked the vault?" Holmes asked. "I did, sir, with Mr. Lestrade of the Yard standing by. He had been sent for on account of some unfortunate trouble with the crowd. We opened to find Mr. Horatio Pelling lying as he had been laid, no disturbance, and the candle, set in the niche, still guttering. But the glass of the lantern was cold to the touch, though I had lit it with my own hand not 10 minutes previously, and there was, upon the inside of the vault door, a smear of something black, gritty, like coal dust, mixed with fine sand. Mr. Lestrade took a pinch and wrapped it in paper." Holmes's mouth twitched at the name of our energetic acquaintance. "Lestrade, then, is engaged?" "He is, sir. He believes some mischief was done by Mr. Basil's enemies. There's talk of debts, and that Fowler the man tried to stop it and took a blow for his pains. But there's the difficulty no one can get past. There is one way to that vault, and we watched it. And there is the bell. The engineer from Barnaby's, a stout fellow with a wrench, says no man living could stifle a bell that size without a contrivance, and there was no contrivance. He swears it." Holmes had risen without my noticing, and now stood with hands clasped behind him, his hawk-like profile turned half toward the window, half toward the verger. "The chalk mark," he said. "You described it as a circle with 3 short lines, underlined. Did those lines lie within the circumference or without?" "Within, sir." "Good. The scrap of paper from Fowler's hand?" Keene delved into his breast, withdrew a small envelope, and passed it to Holmes as gingerly as though it might fly away. Holmes extracted a torn fragment of thick, cream-coloured stock. Upon it there clung a faint aroma, not of church wax, but of some lighter oil, paraffin perhaps, and a suggestion of lavender. In the upper corner a flourish of copper plate survived, deeds. "St. Jude's," I suggested. Holmes did not look up. "Possibly, or any word ending thus, though the apostrophe is interesting." He held the paper to the firelight, then to the window. "A blind embossed crest has been pressed out from the reverse. No ink, something with a shield and an object that might be a torch or a sheaf." He let the fragment fall into his palm. "You spoke of grit upon the inside of the vault door, Mr. Keene. Was there aught upon the threshold? A trace upon the stone? Black, like the rest. And on Fowler's sleeve, a little reddish powder, brick dust, I'd have said." Holmes nodded once, as a man marks a point on an invisible map. "And Mr. Pelling's history?" "Briefly." "The old gentleman was of a charitable turn when it suited him and close-fisted when it did not," Keene said. "And there was a mixture of loyalty and resentment in his tone, such as one hears in men tied to aristocratic whims. He had interests in shipping, lives at Norham Place, but gave to the church when Mrs. Pelling was alive. She loved the stained glass, sir. He made enemies, I cannot deny. There was a quarrel with a Mr. Silas Drew, a warehouseman at the docks, something about unpaid accounts, and a nephew, Basil, who is of a restless temper. Mr. Basil stands to inherit. There is also Miss Camilla Bray, Mrs. Pelling's niece. Devout and very beautiful, as ladies go, she and Mr. Basil do not speak. "Ah," said Holmes in that thin tone which means neither approval nor the reverse. "And the constables outside?" "Constable Pike and a lad named Bonny. They kept the lane clear. No one passed their line at the hour, not that they saw." Holmes's gaze sharpened in an instant. "Not that they saw? Excellent. You will remain in town, Mr. Keene?" "Until the funeral is concluded, sir. We mean to try the bell again at noon, but—" He broke off, and the fear that had been kept under a labourer's grip of himself crept back over his features. "If it fails before the mourners, if the silence comes again, there'll be talk. The parish do not like what they do not understand." Holmes's eyes had gone far away. "Nor do they like what they misunderstand. Very good. You have done wisely to come." He flicked the grit from the paper into a small glass vial and labelled it with a pencil, as neat as any apothecary. "Watson, your hat. St. Jude's in Walsingham Lane. London will have had few services more in need of a physician's presence, if only for the nerves. Mr. Keene, you will conduct us?" "With gratitude, sir." As the verger rose, his hat brushing his sleeve, a few grains of something dark fell upon my carpet. Holmes stooped at once, and with a swift motion captured them upon the blade of his penknife. He held the edge to his nose, then to mine. There was no odour I could detect, but the particles clung to the steel in a manner peculiar, as soot will not. "It is curious, Watson," he murmured for my ear alone as we followed Keene toward the door. "A bell that is felt but not heard, a vault which is watched and yet received a visitor, a man robbed of his voice by nothing that left a mark, and a symbol, 3 small lines within a circle which any schoolboy might draw, and yet which was drawn at precisely the wrong height for a boy's hand." His fingers closed upon the vial. "When London grows quiet, it is because someone has taught it to listen. Let us discover to whom it has lent its ear." We descended to the street where the fog had thickened into a pale broth, and even the cry of the muffin man seemed smothered. Keene led us toward the waiting cab, the wheels whispering upon the wet stones. As we climbed in, Holmes turned his face toward the east, where the city's many spires pricked the murk like knitting needles through wool. "St. Jude," he said, half to himself, "patron of lost causes, an unfortunate dedication for any criminal who believes his own trade a certainty." And with that he rapped the roof, and we set out toward the church and the silence that lay beneath it. Keene's anxious back was as eloquent as any sermon while we jolted through the swaddled streets toward Walsingham Lane. It is my habit, when we are so conveyed, to watch Holmes rather than the window. The one landscape is constant, the other instructive. I observed that he had turned the little vial of dark grit between finger and thumb until a faint smear ringed the glass, then stopped altogether and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were bright and very far away, like a man looking down upon a chessboard from a gallery. St. Jude's presented itself as a mass of shadow pressed into Gothic lines, flying buttresses shouldered. By fog, a square tower cropped flat against the low sky. The lane was narrow. The lamplighter had left halos rather than light. We were admitted at once by a nervous curate who crossed himself almost imperceptibly upon seeing Holmes, as though genius and sorcery were cousins. Within, the air was as Keene had promised, old stone, old beeswax, and something more metallic hanging faintly in the draught, a scent that put me in mind of a hospital's galvanic apparatus, after it has been run too long. Lestrade awaited us in the nave, his compact silhouette square against the chancel rail.
"Holmes!"
he cried with more relief than rancour. "I might have guessed Keene would fetch you. You find me with a family that won't be soothed, a bell that has lost its manners, and a mute valet who stares like a cod." "Your flock has ever been diverse, Lestrade," Holmes returned, glancing beyond him. "Mr. Basil Pelling?" A young man of fashion, all silks imperfectly masking a restless bone, advanced with an expression that darted between defiance and deference. Near him, in sober grey, with a veil thrown back, stood a lady whose composure might have been carved, only her hands, clasped upon her prayer book, betrayed any life by their whitened grip. "My cousin by marriage, Miss Camilla Bray," Basil said with clipped civility. "We are, I fear, the subjects of an unpleasant entertainment." "Not the performers, then?" Holmes murmured. He bowed to the lady, who inclined her head without the least softening of her gaze. "We shall need the tower, Lestrade, and the crypt. I prefer the tower first. When one is told that silence has been commanded, it is useful to visit the place that ought to be most noisy." The stair to the belfry was a mean corkscrew of stone, worn into troughs by generations of feet. Keene's lantern swung before us. The flame guttered, recovered, and guttered again as if reluctant to climb. The interval between each landing seemed to carry its own weather, one damp, one close, one tinged with a draught so cold it bit. "Note, Watson," Holmes said softly, "how the air shifts. The tower has more than the usual mouths." He tapped the wall with a knuckle at one turn. It gave back a hollow tone. At the bell chamber we paused, for the thing hung there in the dark like a moon extinguished. The clock hammer, set upon its frame, waited with a black patience. Keene held the lantern so that the bronze took a timid sheen. "There she is, sir." I swore to myself she had been bewitched. Holmes did not answer. He ran a finger along the bell's lip, then along the cheek, where the hammer must strike, and finally inside the mouth, where the clapper hung. He sniffed his fingertips and smiled the smallest degree. "You have had a visitor, madam," he told the bell. "Watson, your handkerchief." With a surgeon's neatness, he wiped a narrow ring from the inner rim and folded the cloth upon itself, imprisoning whatever trace he had caught. Then, producing from his pocket a small horseshoe magnet he sometimes uses to illustrate points in electricity, he touched it lightly to a dark speck that had lodged upon the clapper's hinge. The speck leapt obediently. "Iron filings," I hazarded. "Among other friends," said he. "Keene, how often is the bell cleaned?" "Weekly, sir, but never so far up. Only what a man may reach with a ladder." "Quite." He stooped to the timber bed where the mechanism lay, and, with the lantern lowered, showed me a tiny pinch of something black caught in the crude grease at a joint. "There is your gritty smear in another guise. To deaden a bell, one may interpose softness between blow and bronze. To deafen it, one may attack the music itself. Mr. Pelling's midnight called for resonance across a column of air. Someone has arranged that the air should do as little work as possible. I confess the physics of bells are not within my accustomed practice, but the conviction in Holmes's tone carried me farther than my understanding. "You suggest a vacuum?" I ventured, glancing at the vast mouth. "A cathedral jar would be a trifle large to evacuate," he returned, dryly. "No, nothing so grand. Observe instead the dusting along the rim, fine as though sifted, and the faint tack upon the finger. A film, Watson, something brushed where none would care to look. Enough to alter vibration, not enough to affront an engineer's eye by daylight." "Some varnish?" said Lestrade from behind us. He had advanced with a suspicious care, as though the bell might bite. or church wax. Paraffin would be an excellent thought in winter, Holmes said, and his nostrils flared almost imperceptibly. Paraffin, and a companion to please the senses of the person who carries it. He turned his head toward me, and I recalled the ghost of lavender upon the torn fragment in our rooms. We descended. On the third landing, Holmes paused and set his palm flat to the wall again.
"Hollow here, solid there,"
he murmured, rapping twice.
"And here, behind this stone, a draught
that comes not from outside." He took out his penknife and, with the gentlest persuasion, teased a grain from the mortar. It came away stained the same faint red that had freckled Fowler's sleeve. He held it beneath the lantern. "Brick dust, from a place where brick has no business," he said. "Let us see your crypt." The stairs sank us into a cold that rose to meet the bones. The passage to the Pelling vault was narrow, the flags damp, the candle stubs in their iron brackets drowned in their own tears. There, upon the right-hand wall at a man's shoulder height, was the chalk mark Keene had described, a circle within which ran 3 short dashes, each underlined as if to assert their import with a schoolmaster's severity. Holmes regarded it without expression, then took a scale from his pocket and measured the centre.
5 feet 8
from the floor, he observed, drawn by a hand that writes from the right and is unused to chalk. The pressure fails toward the tail of the underline. Lestrade snorted. "You can tell all that from a child's scrawl?" "From a man's scrawl," Holmes corrected mildly. "Children do not underline a cipher they comprehend. Men underline what they fear. Others will not." Within the vault, the long box lay in its niche, decorous and mute. The lantern on its hook gave no more than a cubit of light, and yet gave it steadily. I touched the glass by reflex and found, to my surprise, that it possessed no warmth. "You said this was cold last night, though lit 10 minutes, I recalled to Keene. "Aye, Doctor." Holmes crouched at the inner face of the door. There, barely visible unless one knelt as he now did, was the thin smear of black he had been told of, caught along the edge where it would transfer to any sleeve that passed. He took another grain for his collection, and then raised his head, listening. "Do you hear it, Watson?" "I hear nothing." "Exactly." He stood, dusted his knee. "One expects a living church to mutter. Pipes, a breath through the stone, the perpetual small complaint of wood. Your silence, Mr. Keene, is not the absence of sound, it is a sound of its own." He looked to Lestrade. "Your constables?" "In the vestry," said Lestrade. "Pike is steady. The lad Bonny is, well, a lad." "I shall want them both, one after the other, and the family after that," Holmes said. "Also the engineer from Barnaby's to tell me what he did not see. Watson, have a glance at Fowler, if you please. A dumb man may speak to a doctor after he has failed a dozen policemen." We found the unfortunate servant laid upon a pew wrapped in a borrowed rug, his eyes following every movement with a hound's anxiety. His tongue was unharmed, his pulse was strong though quickened, his throat showed no bruising. When I made as if to examine his larynx with the spoon of my pocket lamp, he flinched violently, then mastered himself with an effort that moved me. "Shock will do much," I said to Holmes, "but I think there has been more than shock. His voice has not been taken by violence, it has been coaxed away. The air in that passage is ill. I should like him in fresher quarters." Holmes nodded once, already slipping from us toward the nave with the peculiar, noiseless tread he reserves for indoor hunting. Over his shoulder he said, in that tone which sounds idle and means everything, "We shall let the church speak at noon. Until then, Watson, we must listen to those who wished it silent at midnight." When I returned from tending to Fowler, Holmes was already at work upon the church floor, moving with that feline precision which makes even Lestrade's boots sound like blasphemy. He had requisitioned 2 tapers from the altar and set them in curious alignment upon the chancel step, their flames bending, faintly, toward the north aisle as if drawn by some invisible breath. Lestrade watched with that uneasy patience which only long acquaintance with Holmes could teach him, and Keene stood wringing his cap, whispering small prayers beneath his breath. "You will observe," Holmes said, his tone absent yet exact, "that the draught through this nave does not behave as draughts do in honest churches. The flame leans steadily, not in gusts, but in a constant persuasion. There is air moving here that has no right to move, air from below, not above." He straightened and indicated the flagstones beneath the choir rail. "Your vault, Mr. Keene, has a vent, whether for drainage or for something less innocent, we shall presently determine." He drew from his pocket a coil of thin twine and fastened one end to a small metal button which he placed upon the flagged floor. The other end he passed through his fingers, watching it settle. "Notice, Watson," he murmured, "the vibration, barely perceptible yet steady. Something beneath us breathes, mechanically perhaps." Lestrade frowned. "You mean there's a man under the floor?" Holmes smiled in the half-light. "If there were, he would have suffocated during the vigil. No, my dear Lestrade, we are dealing with a device, or a contrivance whose appetite for air is most particular." He knelt, feeling along the edge of the paving, until his fingertips caught a faint recess filled with mortar. "Ah, a joint too clean by half." Producing his penknife, he scraped delicately. A flake came away, revealing a hairline seam between stones. From within, a thin whisper of colder air escaped, so fine that the taper nearest guttered, then righted itself. "Excellent," Holmes murmured. "The lungs of our silence lie here." At his instruction, Keene fetched an iron rod from the vestry. Holmes inserted it into the fissure and levered gently. A square slab shifted with a reluctant sigh. Beneath lay a narrow cavity lined in brick, descending into blackness. From it came the unmistakable smell of metal, oil, and extinguished flame. Lestrade bent, craning to peer within. "Good Lord, there's been work done here. Pipes, wires, some sort of box." Holmes took the lantern and leaned close, his voice a low hum of satisfaction. "Copper tubing, insulated wire, ingenious. This was no amateur's mischief. Our silence, gentlemen, was manufactured." He withdrew the lantern and replaced the slab with delicate precision. "We shall not disturb it further until daylight. To tamper now would warn our adversary that his secret breathes still." Keene crossed himself again. "You mean, sir, someone's built a machine under the church?" "Built or concealed one," Holmes replied. "The question is which purpose it serves, to silence a bell or to muffle something less innocent. Tell me, Lestrade, did you notice any labourers about the church these past weeks?" "Only a man from Barnaby's, mending the clockworks, came twice, stayed late the second night, said the gears needed alignment." "Did he indeed?" Holmes's voice was soft as ash. "And Mr. Barnaby himself, can we summon him?" Lestrade shook his head. "He's off to Birmingham for a job. Left 2 days before the funeral." "Then we must make do with his employee. Find his name. I dare say the verger can oblige." While Lestrade went to inquire, Holmes rose and stood at the centre of the nave, drawing slow circles in the air with his forefinger as though mapping unseen harmonies. "Watson," he said quietly, "note the interval between our discoveries. Lavender upon the torn card, paraffin upon the bell, iron filings upon the clapper, and now the whisper of machinery beneath the floor. What single mind unites perfume, engineering, and ecclesiastical access?" I considered. A craftsman in service to one of the family, or a woman of refinement with some mechanical ally? Holmes's lips curved. Very good. The combination suggests a partnership, and partnership implies trust, or dependency. I should very much like to know upon whom Mr. Basil Pelling depends, for his eyes betray a sleepless familiarity with fear. Before I could answer, footsteps echoed from the transept, and Lestrade reappeared with a folded paper. "The fellow's name is Samuel Rourke," he said. "Worked for Barnaby's 8 months, dismissed last year for pilfering fittings, reappeared under another name, Sims, and took private jobs. Keene swears he's seen him loitering near the vestry since." "Splendid," Holmes said briskly. "We shall call upon Mr. Rourke, or Sims, before the day grows old. Meanwhile, the family must be questioned." Miss Bray and Mr. Basil were summoned to the vestry, where the chill was tempered only by the steady tick of the church clock. The young man entered first, colour high, one glove missing. Miss Bray followed, her composure unbroken. "Mr. Pelling," Holmes began, "we are told the vigil was at your insistence." "Yes, my uncle's wishes were precise. He abhorred music and ceremony, preferred silence. It seemed fitting the bell should toll once for him at midnight and no more. Yet it did not toll at all." Basil's mouth tightened. "That is hardly my fault. I was in the crypt with the others when the thing failed. I suppose I should thank Providence for sparing us the embarrassment of its clanging." Holmes regarded him with that faint, cool amusement that can strip a man's patience bare. "Embarrassment is a mild sentiment to attach to death. You were fond of your uncle?" "I respected him," Basil said shortly. "He provided for me, if that is what you mean. I was his heir. Am I now to be accused because a bell lost its voice?" Holmes ignored the challenge. "And you, Miss Bray, did you share in this vigil willingly?" She met his gaze without flinching. "I did. I loved my aunt, and I respected Mr. Pelling as her husband. I thought the vigil morbid, but I remained to support my cousin." "Did you notice anyone leaving or entering the nave before the hour struck?" Her eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly, toward Basil. "No one that I saw." Holmes's voice grew gentler. "Sometimes what we do not see tells more than what we do. Thank you, Miss Bray. I shall not detain you further." When they had gone, Lestrade let out a grunt. "He's prickly enough for guilt, that one." "Prickly, yes," Holmes said. "But guilt and fear are not the same hue. He is frightened of discovery, but not of crime. His eyes move like those of a man who listens for something expected." He turned abruptly toward the doorway. "Come, Watson, there remains one other witness to consult, the church itself. At noon the bell shall attempt its resurrection, and I have no wish to be caught unprepared when it finds its voice or loses it again." Outside, the fog had thinned into a bruised daylight. Holmes stood at the foot of the tower, gloved hands behind his back, face lifted to the mute bell above. "When metal refuses to speak," he said, half to himself, "it is because some other sound drowns it. Let us wait, my dear fellow, and see what silence says when the hour comes." The hands of the church clock crept toward noon with a kind of theatrical slowness, as though aware that all eyes were upon it. Holmes stood motionless beneath the tower, his head slightly bent, and his eyes half closed, as if listening to some private frequency beyond mortal range. The small crowd that had gathered, villagers, vergers, 2 constables, and the curious Miss Bray, kept to a reverent hush, broken only by the occasional clatter of a horse passing along Walsingham Lane. Lestrade paced like a man expecting thunder and finding instead an unbearable calm. Holmes, with his usual disregard for ceremony, removed one glove and placed his bare hand upon the cold stone of the tower wall. "You may think me fanciful, Watson," he murmured without looking at me, but stone holds its own kind of memory. It trembles before it speaks. He withdrew his hand, flexing the fingers lightly. Now, watch the birds. I followed his gaze. A few pigeons perched upon the belfry's edge had begun to shift uneasily, their wings twitching as though some pressure mounted in the air. The sound of the hour wheel clicked faintly above. A hush fell, deep enough that I could hear my own pulse. Then came the hammer's descent, a clean metallic stroke, and yet again the impossible. Silence. No sound followed the blow, not a tone, not even the dull echo one expects when a mechanism misfires. The very air seemed to fold in on itself. Miss Bray gave a faint cry and pressed a hand to her breast. Lestrade swore under his breath. Keene, standing nearest the church door, turned a shade paler than the wax of the candles he trimmed. Holmes's reaction was instantaneous, but contained. He raised a hand for quiet, his head cocked like a hound catching scent. "You heard nothing," he said softly. "But you felt it, did you not? A pressure here." He tapped his chest. A resonance swallowed whole. "By heaven, Holmes," I whispered, "it's like the air refused to carry the sound." "Just so," he replied. "And yet sound must go somewhere. Energy does not die. It only changes its disguise." He turned to Lestrade, eyes keen. "Now the tower. Quickly, before our adversary knows the experiment succeeded." We ascended the winding stair once more, Keene's lantern swaying ahead of us. The smell that met us halfway up was unmistakably mechanical, the tang of heated metal and a faint trace of oil mingled with something sweet and acrid that stung the throat. Holmes stopped abruptly, crouched, and pressed his hand to the wall. "Warm," he said, "but no sun touches this stone. There's activity within the cavity we uncovered earlier." At the belfry, he moved straight to the trap we had replaced that morning. It was warm to the touch. He knelt, listening. "There," he said, a faint hum like a hive before storm. He drew a small tuning fork from his pocket, struck it against the beam, and held it over the crack. The note faltered almost at once, swallowed by the air as if consumed. Holmes's smile returned, thin, bright, and dangerous. "Beautiful. Someone has built a resonator, a machine designed to devour vibration itself." "Ingenious, Watson. Monstrous, but ingenious." Lestrade frowned. "A resonator? You mean it eats sound?" "In a sense," Holmes replied. "A chamber of tuned plates, perhaps magnetized, that neutralize acoustic waves through interference. A kind of silent engine, crude by laboratory standards, but effective when hidden beneath a church floor." He tapped the stone with a fingernail. "And our builder knows his physics well enough to match the bell's frequency precisely. Hence, nothing." Keene crossed himself yet again. "But why, sir? Why rob a church bell of its voice? That, Mr. Keene, is the one question that contains all the others. To stifle a signal is as deliberate as to give one. A bell that cannot ring, cannot summon, cannot warn." Holmes rose. "Watson, you recall the nephew's unease. He listens for something that does not come. What if the silence itself was arranged for him?" Before I could answer, a shout rose from below. A constable's voice, urgent and echoing up the stair. "Inspector, come quick! Fowler's awake and he's trying to speak." We hurried down. In the vestry, the poor fellow was half upright upon the pew, his eyes wide and glistening with effort. His lips moved soundlessly until Holmes crouched beside him and motioned for calm. Fowler seized Holmes's wrist and with visible agony forced out a single cracked whisper, "Under... light... door!" Then his strength failed, and he slumped, back, exhausted but breathing. Holmes repeated the words quietly. Under, light, door, curious. He stood, scanning the walls. Which door, I wonder? There are several that lead below. The crypt door, I offered. Possibly, but the phrasing suggests proximity, something under the light near a door. Keen, is there any lantern fixed by the crypt entrance? Yes, sir. A small brass sconce, always lit for services. It hangs above the old sacristy door next to the steps down. Holmes was already moving, his coat brushing the pews. Excellent. Come, all of you. The dead man's servant may have pointed us straight to his master's murderer. We descended once more into the undercroft, where the lantern in question burned with its usual steady flame. Holmes examined the bracket closely. Not the lamp itself, he murmured, but the shadow it casts. He motioned for Lestrade to hold the light lower. On the flagstone directly beneath, where centuries of wax and dust had hardened into dull patterns, there was now a faint new mark, an irregular patch as though something square had once rested there and been removed. Holmes knelt, brushing the surface with his fingertips. Fresh disturbance, he muttered. And, soot again, our black dust. He looked sharply toward the vault door. Watson, note the chain securing it. New iron, bright polish, installed recently. Who has keys to this door, Keene? Only myself and the late Mr. Pelling, sir. The nephew would have access through me, of course, but none other. Holmes's expression darkened. The dead hold keys only when the living allow it. I believe our machine beneath the nave is not the sole contrivance here. Observe, this wall behind the lantern is thinner than the rest, and if I am not mistaken, he struck it sharply with his cane. A hollow echo replied, Exactly as I thought. Behind this wall lies a recess, narrow, perhaps hidden, since the church's foundation was altered. Our criminal required both concealment and power. He found them in holy stone. Lestrade blinked. Power? For what? For his machine, Inspector. The bell's silence was no mere trick of sound. It masked the theft of something or someone, while all attention fixed upon the failure above. Our culprit wished the church deaf while his hands worked unseen. Good Lord, I said. You mean a distraction? Holmes nodded once. A perfect one. We must open this wall, but discreetly. I should like to examine its contents before our silent engineer returns to ensure they remain so. Even as he spoke, there came a faint scrape from the nave above, like the drag of metal across stone. Holmes froze. His eyes met mine. He's here, he whispered. Stay back, Watson. The man who kills sound may have no compunction about killing witnesses. The lantern trembled slightly in Keene's hand as the noise repeated. A measured scrape, a pause, then the soft thud of footsteps overhead. Holmes extinguished the light with a pinch of his fingers, plunging us into near darkness. Now, he breathed, let us see if the silence moves. For a long moment there was nothing but the quickened rhythm of our own breath and the faint pulse of the city somewhere beyond the stone. Then the sound came again, slow, deliberate, metallic. A tool, not a footstep. Someone was working above us with patient stealth. Holmes moved without a word, his hand lightly on my sleeve, guiding me backward into the narrow angle of the crypt wall. The darkness pressed close. Even Keene's trembling lantern flame seemed a thing too loud to exist. Holmes touched his lips with a gloved finger, then leaned to whisper so faintly that I felt the words more than heard them. He believes the church empty. We shall let him continue. The scraping persisted for half a minute longer, punctuated by the muffled click of a latch and the muted creak of a hinge. Dust trickled from the ceiling, fine as ash. Holmes's head tilted sharply. The hatch to the tower stair? He breathed. He's entering by the maintenance door above the vestry. Curious, bravery born of habit, not ignorance. Our man knows this church better than the verger. We waited, then came a single, dull blow, followed by another as though iron struck timber. A soft thump followed, the sound of something heavy being set down upon wood. Holmes's hand gripped my arm, and in the dark I could sense his mind racing. "He brings another instrument," he murmured, "either to maintain the silence or to silence those who discovered it." He slipped from my grasp and began to ascend the stair with extraordinary lightness, his coat brushing stone in ghost-like whispers. I followed close, Keen behind me, clutching his lantern in a shaking hand. When we reached the halfway landing, the glow of another lamp was visible above, swinging in uncertain arcs. Holmes gestured for me to hold, then advanced alone, noiseless as breath. A figure stood at the far end of the belfry platform, half bent over the trap we had uncovered earlier. The man was compact, dressed in rough workman's clothes, his sleeves rolled high, revealing forearms blackened with oil. The flicker of his lantern threw the pallor of his face into harsh relief. Cheekbones sharp, eyes intent as those of a rat cornered by its own curiosity. Beside him rested a narrow wooden crate, its lid already loosened. Within it gleamed coils of copper wire and small glass bulbs, each filled with pale fluid that caught the light like frozen lightning. Holmes stepped forward suddenly, his voice cutting through the air with surgical precision. "Mr. Rourke, I presume." The man started, the lantern swinging violently. For one instant his eyes flashed, not with fear but calculation. Then his hand darted to his coat pocket. Holmes was faster. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides, seized the man's wrist, and twisted it downward. A small revolver clattered to the floor. "Your manners disappoint me," Holmes said coldly. "A craftsman of your skill should know the value of a steady hand." Rourke, panting, tried to wrench free. "You've no right here," he spat. "Church business, private contract." "Indeed, with the dead, perhaps?" Holmes replied. "You built the resonator under the nave, I think. Ingenious, though somewhat crude in its tuning. The late Mr. Pelling hired you, I imagine. For work upon the clock tower, you took the opportunity to install your device, no doubt for a more personal commission." The man's lips tightened. "You don't know what you're saying?" "On the contrary," Holmes said. "You were not silencing a bell, you were concealing a transaction. The midnight hour was to cover something being removed from the vault below, while the machinery absorbed the sound of chisels or locks. What was taken, Rourke? Gold plate, jewels, or documents your employer feared might speak louder than metal?" Rourke's gaze flicked involuntarily toward the crate. Holmes noted it, of course. He notes everything. "Ah," he said softly. "So the work continues even after your master's death. The machine must serve another purpose now, and yet you return, risking discovery, to finish it. That suggests you are desperate, not loyal." The man said nothing, but the sweat upon his brow betrayed him. Holmes gestured to me. "Watson, if you would be so kind as to open that crate." I pried the lid fully away. Inside, beneath the coils and glass, lay several small canisters labelled in neat black script, diethyl ether, highly volatile. Beneath those, folded parchment and sealing wax. I drew one roll free and saw the broken impression of a family crest, the same shield and torch embossed upon the fragment found in Fowler's hand. Holmes examined the document quickly, his eyes flicking over the ink. "A contract," he murmured, "and not for any clockwork. This bears the signature of Horatio Pelling himself. A transfer of shares in the Thames Iron Syndicate, backdated and witnessed by a man now mute. Fowler, of course?" He turned his gaze on Rourke. "You forged this, did you not? The silence you engineered was meant to hide the theft of Pelling's seal from the vault during the vigil, so the document might later appear genuine." But your employer, perhaps Mr. Basil, lost his nerve, or his partner double-crossed him. Which was it? Rourke's face hardened. You think you know everything. You don't know what that old man kept down there. Not gold, not papers, something worse. He made me build that thing to keep it quiet. Holmes's eyes narrowed. To keep what quiet? The man swallowed. You'll see soon enough. I only came to take my tools and be gone. Holmes's reply was a whisper. I fear it's far too late for that. Before either of us could move, Rourke lunged sideways, striking Holmes squarely in the shoulder and seizing the lantern. It shattered against the beam, plunging us into sudden darkness as flames licked the floorboards. Keane shrieked. I caught a glimpse of Rourke's form vaulting toward the stairwell, his boots clanging on the iron rungs. Holmes was after him instantly, his silhouette slicing through the smoke. We gave chase, stumbling down through the thickening haze. The scent of burning oil filled the air. Below, the door to the nave burst open with a crash. Lestrade appeared, revolver drawn. "What's happening?" he shouted. "Stop him!" Holmes called. "The verger's hatch." Rourke was already at it, wrenching at the bolt. Seeing us, he turned the pistol he had recovered from the floor and fired wildly. The shot ricocheted off stone. Holmes closed the distance, struck the man's wrist with a precision born of study, and sent the weapon spinning into shadow. Rourke stumbled back, his heel catching the open hatch's edge. For a heartbeat, he hung there, arms flailing. Then he vanished into the darkness below, the dull thud of his body echoing from the crypt. Silence followed, thick, absolute, more dreadful than the gunfire. Keane's lantern guttered out completely, leaving only the crackle of the small fire above and the relentless ticking of the church clock. Holmes leaned over the hatch, his face lit by the faint glow from below. "He lives?" I asked, peering beside him. Holmes's eyes reflected that strange stillness which comes when thought outruns speech. "Perhaps. But he has fallen close to the wall we suspected, where something was hidden. The irony, Watson, is that our thief may now lie upon the very secret he sought to protect." Lestrade wiped his brow. "Then by heaven, let's fetch him out before the whole place goes up." Holmes's voice was calm, almost detached. "Yes, but carefully, Inspector. For I believe that what lies under that wall is the reason the church learned to keep its silence, and the reason men have already killed to preserve it." The smoke thinned as we descended into the crypt once more, our boots slipping upon the cold stone steps where centuries of moisture had made the surface slick. Holmes moved first, holding the rescued lantern high, its faint light striking the air like a trembling blade. Below, the silence was deeper than ever. Even the fire above seemed smothered by the heavy stones. Lestrade followed with his revolver drawn, muttering about madmen and churches, while I brought up the rear with Keane, whose face was white and wet as plaster. When we reached the vault floor, Rourke lay crumpled near the wall that Holmes had declared hollow, his right leg twisted unnaturally, his breath ragged but alive. A shallow pool of blood had begun to spread beneath his shoulder, glistening like oil. Holmes knelt beside him and laid 2 fingers against his neck. "He will live a short while," he said quietly. "Long enough, I hope to tell us what was worth all this noise for silence." Rourke's eyes fluttered open, dull and clouded. His lips moved with the stubbornness of a dying man clinging to purpose. "It wasn't mine," he whispered. "I built what he wanted. That's all." "Who wanted it?" Holmes asked sharply. Rourke's breath hitched. "Pelling. Old Pelling. Said he'd bought something he shouldn't have. Wanted it locked away where no ear could reach it. Said it sang." He swallowed painfully. "Couldn't bear the sound any more." "What sang?" Holmes's voice was almost tender. "The box," Rourke breathed. "Under the wall. He made me seal it in, told me the bell must drown it when it wakes. When the bell failed, it started again." His eyes rolled back. His last exhale was a dry whisper. "Don't open it." His body sagged, stilling completely. For a moment, the only sound was the faint rattle of a chain somewhere above, the dying echo of the bell's mechanism shifting in its sleep. Holmes rose slowly, the lantern's glow drawing deep lines in his face. "Watson," he said, his tone thoughtful rather than grim, "fetch the crowbar from the vestry." I stared at him. "You mean to open it after he warned us not to?" "My dear fellow," Holmes replied with a trace of impatience, "the man's conscience awoke an hour too late. Whatever lies behind this wall has already dictated 3 crimes and at least 1 death. It will not be content to remain in shadow much longer." Lestrade frowned, wiping soot from his forehead. "If there's danger, I'll have my men fetch a team—" Holmes cut him short. "And have half the parish here by dawn. No inspector. I prefer the company of silence while dealing with matters that may not bear witness kindly." I brought the bar, though not without reluctance. Holmes wedged it into the crack Rourke had begun and pressed with measured force. The mortar crumbled. The ancient bricks gave a faint sigh as dust filled the air. Keene crossed himself again, his voice a tremulous prayer. When the opening was wide enough for a hand, Holmes set down the tool and leaned forward, peering within. A narrow chamber lay beyond, scarcely 4 feet deep and 6 high, sealed long ago. Within, upon a rough plinth of stone, rested a small chest of dark wood, bound in iron. The grain of it shimmered faintly in the lantern light, though the air within the cavity was perfectly still. On the lid was engraved the same circle with 3-line symbol we had seen scrawled in chalk upon the crypt wall. Holmes regarded it with that peculiar, hungry fascination he reserves for puzzles that flirt with madness. "Do you see, Watson? The symbol repeated, drawn above, to mark what lies below. Not superstition, but instruction." Lestrade stepped forward uneasily. "Looks like any old box to me." "Then I suggest you let me open it before presuming it ordinary," Holmes said dryly. He examined the hinges, then the lock, an old contrivance of twin tumblers. Producing a slender steel pick from his pocket, he went to work with the precision of a surgeon. The mechanism gave a muted click. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, as Holmes lifted the lid, a faint vibration passed through the floor, so subtle I thought it a trick of nerves. Inside lay a cluster of cylindrical tubes of thin glass, each sealed with wax and containing what appeared to be fine, metallic filaments. Among them, folded like an afterthought, was a single sheet of parchment covered in equations and notations, too complex for my quick reading. But it was the faint hum that filled the air, a sound so low it seemed to live just beneath hearing, that turned my stomach to ice. Holmes's eyes shone. "An acoustic experiment," he breathed. By heaven, this man Pelling was no mere collector. He was dabbling in resonance, in harmonic frequencies of matter itself. Look here, the filaments are tuned lengths of silver wire, and the inscriptions, these are frequencies measured in cycles. He must have believed he'd found a tone capable of— what? Affecting the nervous system, perhaps even the brain. Lestrade shifted uneasily. "You're telling me this thing sings?" Holmes's voice lowered. "In a sense, imagine a sound pitched beyond human hearing, one that vibrates through stone rather than air. Such a tone could unsettle the mind, paralyze speech, even induce hallucinations. It would explain Fowler's muteness, the sensation of pressure, the deathly hush of the church at midnight. Pelling's invention must have been accidentally or deliberately activated. I felt the hum growing stronger, thrumming through my boots. Holmes, the sound, it's increasing. He nodded grimly. The resonance has been disturbed by our opening the chamber. The air pressure inside was holding it dormant.
What do we do?
Keene gasped.
It'll drive us mad.
Holmes seized the crowbar.
We restore equilibrium. Watson, bring the bell's clapper to rest against its rim. If sound can suppress sound, then the one tuned to St. Jude's bell will nullify this abomination.
Before I could question him, he was already ascending, his long frame vanishing into the stair's darkness. The rest of us followed as the hum deepened into a pulse that thudded within the skull rather than the ear. The walls themselves seemed to tremble. I staggered once, nearly falling. Lestrade caught my arm. When we burst into the belfry, Holmes was at the great bell, his face pale but determined.
"Now, Watson!"
he cried. Together we swung the clapper forward and let it strike. For an instant I feared the note would again die unheard, but this time it rang, clear and pure, shattering the oppressive air like glass. The vibration roared down through the tower and into the church below, colliding with the hidden tone in a clash that felt almost physical. The hum broke apart with a sudden, wrenching groan, and then silence, vast and clean. Holmes leaned against the bell frame, breathing hard. "There," he said softly. "The silence this time is honest." When we returned to the crypt, the chest lay still, its tubes dark and lifeless. The faint smell of ozone lingered, sharp and electric. Lestrade exhaled and holstered his revolver. "So the old man made the devil's tuning fork, did he?" Holmes gazed at the box, thoughtful. "No, Inspector. He merely stumbled upon a note the world was never meant to hear, and tried, in vain, to quiet it. But others, less cautious, sought to profit by the silence he left behind, and they have paid for it." He turned toward me, eyes weary, yet alight with that strange mix of melancholy and triumph I had come to know so well. "Come, Watson, let us breathe air unburdened by secrets, for though this church may ring again, I fancy its silence will always be the truer sound." Holmes remained crouched before the shattered cavity. The dead man sprawled behind him, and the faint reek of burnt oil still lingering in the air. The crypt was quieter now, no hum, no resonance, yet that quiet seemed fragile, as though even the sound of a breath might rouse something from its uneasy slumber. The lantern trembled slightly in my hand, and its light caught the edge of Holmes's face, intent, remote, but not untouched by unease. "Close the chamber," he said at last, very softly. "Stone and mortar were meant to seal it, and so they shall again. The thing within has exhausted its voice, but we must not tempt it to sing once more." Lestrade exhaled, half in disbelief, half in relief. "You mean to bury it again? After what we've seen? The Yard will want a report, Holmes. They'll want that box examined." Holmes rose and brushed the dust from his knees. "Examine it, and you'll have half of London raving by dawn. There are discoveries that perish the moment they are looked upon by bureaucracy. No, let the church keep its mystery. The dead man's silence will serve better than any explanation." He glanced down at Rourke's body, his expression unreadable. "Send word to Scotland Yard if you wish, but have them bring bricklayers instead of scientists." Keene, who had been clutching his rosary like a drowning man his rope, gave a choked nod. "Aye, sir. It should never have been opened. I'll see to the mason work myself." Holmes's tone softened. "See that you do, my good man, and keep the bell in working order. Let its sound guard this place, not conceal it." We climbed from the crypt in a heavy silence, the air above feeling miraculously clean after that tomb of half-born science. In the nave, the smoke from the earlier fire hung faintly in the rafters, and the sunlight filtering through the stained glass cast fractured colours across the floor. Holmes paused in the centre aisle, his eyes lifted to the great bell tower above. "Do you hear it, Watson?" he murmured. I listened. Only the wind. Exactly. The sound of nature reasserting itself. A good omen. He turned abruptly to Lestrade, whose brow was furrowed in a mixture of irritation and awe. "You have a corpse, a confession, and an invention better left unnamed. That should suffice for your report, Inspector." Lestrade sighed. "And you? You'll just walk away from all this?" "I seldom walk away, Lestrade," Holmes said with a faint smile. "I simply walk ahead." We left the church through the small north door, stepping into the chill air of late afternoon. The fog had thinned, but the streets were slick with drizzle. Holmes lit his pipe as we walked, the first curl of smoke rising like a signature upon the damp air. For several minutes we went in silence until I could bear my curiosity no longer. "You believe Rourke told the truth?" I asked. "That Pelling himself ordered the device built to contain this tone?" "Undoubtedly," Holmes replied. The old man's fear was evident even in death. Consider the facts, the experiments, the hidden vault, the attempt to muffle the very bell whose sound defined the church. He was no mystic. He was a man at war with his own creation. He bought silence because sound had betrayed him. But how could sound kill? I persisted. Or drive a man mad? Holmes puffed thoughtfully. Every man carries in his body 1,000 instruments that answer to vibration, the bones of the ear, the pulse of the heart, even the rhythm of thought itself. If one could find the note that matches the frequency of life, one might still it, or awaken something in it that should remain asleep. Pelling may have stumbled upon such a note, or thought he had. Either way, he sealed it beneath his church, and fate, as it often does, turned prudence into temptation for lesser minds. We reached Baker Street just as the lamps were being lit. Mrs. Hudson's astonished face greeted us at the door, her mouth opening in question, before Holmes waved her off with a tired but good-natured gesture. "No supper yet, Mrs. Hudson. Tea will suffice. The doctor and I have heard enough strange noises for one day." He threw himself into his chair, stretched out his legs, and regarded the ceiling with a long, satisfied sigh. The firelight glowed against the sharp planes of his face, softening him in a way few ever saw. "Do you know, Watson," he said after a moment, "there was a time when I believed every mystery yielded to logic. This case reminds me that logic, too, has its silences." I smiled faintly. "And yet, as ever, you managed to make sense of it." "Sense," he repeated, as though testing the word. "Perhaps, but comprehension, no. There is something about sound, the invisible made visible through motion, that defies mastery. Music, speech, resonance, they belong as much to the spirit as to the intellect. Even my methods stumble when the unseen begins. To sing." He turned his gaze toward the window, where the fog was beginning to creep back, soft and familiar. "Still, I dare say we have earned a quiet night." I thought him finished, but after a long silence he spoke again, more softly. "One thing troubles me, Watson." I leaned forward. "The box?" "No, the chalk symbol, the circle with the 3 lines. It was not Pelling's mark, it was the mark of a warning. I have seen it once before, years ago, upon a shuttered warehouse by the river, where an acoustical engineer met an abrupt and unexplained end. The symbol denoted a harmonic frequency, 3 vibrations in phase. Whoever chalked it knew exactly what lay beneath St. Jude's. "You think Rourke didn't act alone?" Holmes smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming with renewed interest. "I think, my dear Watson, that somewhere in London there exists another mind attuned to the music of silence, and it will not stay quiet forever." He struck a match and relit his pipe. The smoke coiled upward, mingling with the soft hiss of the fire. Outside, the bells of another parish began to ring, clear and untroubled, their echo drifting faintly through the open window. Holmes closed his eyes, listening, not to the sound itself, I think, but to the spaces between each note. "Ah," he murmured half to himself, "there it is again, the harmony of reason and mystery. The one never complete without the other." And for the rest of that long November evening, neither of us spoke. We simply sat in the glow of the hearth, letting the silence, honest, unbroken, and earned, wrap itself around Baker Street like a final, peaceful chord. The following morning dawned pale and brittle, the kind of London morning that makes the city appear carved from soot and pearl. I found Holmes already at the breakfast table, his long fingers turning a scrap of paper over and over as though it were a coin of strange metal. The tea before him had gone untouched, and a fine ash from his pipe lay strewn across the morning's edition of the Times. He did not look up when I entered. "It has begun again, Watson," he said quietly. I blinked. "What has begun?" Holmes handed me the scrap. It was torn from coarse stationery, bearing a single mark drawn in thick charcoal, the same circle and 3 lines we had seen at St. Jude's. Beneath it, written in a fine, slanted hand, were the words, "The note endures." "It was delivered at dawn," he continued, "by a boy from the telegraph office who swore he found it pinned to the door of Baker Street. No address, no name, only this." I studied the symbol. The simple geometry of it somehow more sinister in the clear morning light. "You believe it's connected to St. Jude's?" "I am certain of it," Holmes replied. "The ink is still damp in places, charcoal rubbed with oil. It's a craftsman's mark, not a scholar's. Whoever drew it knew its purpose." He rose abruptly and began to pace. "And note the phrasing, the note endures." That suggests not a man's boast, but a warning. "The resonance has not died, Watson. It lingers, perhaps, in another place." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "You think the phenomenon has spread?" "Not spread, relocated," he said, pausing by the window. "Sound does not travel through distance alone. It travels through medium. Stone, water, metal, all may carry it. If the frequency from Pelling's device was transmitted through the ground, another sympathetic structure might respond miles away. A warehouse, a tunnel, a factory, anywhere that echoes." He turned sharply. "Get your coat. We're going to the river." We arrived by cab at Wapping, where the Thames lapped against its embankments like a tired beast gnawing its leash. The fog hung low over the water, yellowed by the smoke of morning steamers. Holmes led the way through narrow lanes of brick warehouses, his gaze flicking from wall to wall, as though reading invisible text upon the mortar. At length he stopped before a structure that seemed indistinguishable from its neighbours, tall, windowless, and boarded at the lower level, but carved faintly into the soot-stained stone. Above the doorway was the mark, the same circle, the same 3 lines. "Here," he said softly. "The pattern repeats. The resonance has found another vessel." Lestrade had joined us at Holmes's request, though his expression was one of reluctant scepticism. "You mean to tell me a sound has walked from a church to a warehouse?" "It's not walked, travelled," Holmes corrected. "Like current through wire. Pelling's experiment was no isolated curiosity. It was part of a network. I suspected as much when I saw the quality of his instruments. They were too precise, too costly for one man's obsession. He was financed, perhaps even manipulated." Holmes produced a small metal tuning fork from his pocket and struck it gently against the door. The tone was faint, but carried with it an odd vibration, one that I felt in my ribs rather than heard in my ears. The boards quivered in response. "You feel it?" he asked. Yes, I said. Good Lord Holmes, it's alive. He nodded grimly. The frequency is identical to that of St. Jude's bell. Someone has recreated Pelling's design here, or extended it. And this, he gestured to the symbol, is the key that binds them, a cipher of resonance. Lestrade was unconvinced. All very clever, Holmes, but unless this warehouse starts singing hymns, I can't see that it concerns the yard. Holmes's eyes flashed. Then you might recall the engineer found dead in a riverside shed last year. Head injuries, but no wound. The yard wrote it off as accident, yet the coroner reported inner ear rupture as though the man had been struck by sound alone. The same symbol was chalked upon his door. That silenced Lestrade. He looked at the warehouse, as one might regard a slumbering animal whose size one has suddenly realized. Very well, he muttered. What do you propose? We go in, said Holmes simply. The door gave way after some effort, and a gust of cold, stale air swept over us. Inside, the space was vast and hollow, lined with iron columns and hung with ropes and pulleys that swayed faintly, though no wind entered. In the centre stood a large metal apparatus, half engine, half organ, its pipes vanishing upward into the gloom. A single gas lamp burned beside it, weak and wavering. Holmes approached the machine cautiously, his gaze flicking over the controls, dials, coils, and what appeared to be a crude microphone encased in brass. Remarkable, he whispered. They've harnessed the same principle, but inverted. Instead of swallowing sound, it produces it. The tone that killed Fowler's voice could as easily be used to command obedience or terror. He bent to examine the base, where a tangle of copper wires disappeared into the floor. This is fed by an underground line, most likely from the church itself. The entire system is linked. A man could control the air of half the city from here. I could not help the shiver that passed through me. But for what purpose? Holmes did not answer. He straightened suddenly, his attention fixed upon the far side of the room. There, standing half in shadow, was Miss Camilla Bray. Her veil was gone, and her face, pale, composed, almost luminous in the dim light, betrayed neither surprise nor fear. "I wondered how long it would take you," she said. Her voice carried an eerie calm, and something in its tone made the hairs rise on the back of my neck. Horatio Pelling was my uncle, Mr. Holmes, but his discoveries belong to me now. He sought to bury progress under stone. I seek to raise it into the light. Holmes's voice was low, taut as wire. "You built this, then? You financed Rourke?" "I improved upon them both. The age of reason has deafened itself to wonder, Mr. Holmes. I shall teach it to listen again." She touched a lever at the machine's side. The pipes above began to tremble. Holmes stepped forward sharply. "Miss Bray, stop at once! You have no notion of what this device can do." She smiled faintly. "Oh, but I do. I've heard the note beneath the world. It speaks of order, of purity. Soon everyone will hear it." The machine began to hum, the same dreadful tone we had felt in the crypt, low, growing, alive. The air thickened, the lantern flickered wildly. Lestrade shouted something lost in the din. I stumbled forward, clutching my ears as the vibration rattled my teeth. Holmes lunged toward the lever, but Miss Bray caught his wrist with surprising strength. Their eyes met, and for an instant the air seemed to hold its breath. Then Holmes struck the lever downward with his free hand. The machine screamed, a metallic shriek that split the air, and went dark. Miss Bray staggered back, her face drained of all colour. "You fool," she whispered. "You've silenced the future." Holmes turned to her, his expression grave. "No, madam, I have merely restored the present." The echo of the dying tone faded, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to vibrate still within our bones. Holmes stood very still, the smoke of the extinguished lamp curling about him like the ghost of a sound not yet finished. For a long breath we stood suspended in that unnatural quiet, the warehouse about us holding its iron breath like some great engine arrested in mid-pulse. Then sounds of the ordinary world crept back, the lap of the river, the faint clink of rigging, a cart somewhere upon the cobbles. Lestrade lowered his revolver inch by inch. Miss Bray's eyes, wide and brilliant in the dimness, never left Holmes's face. "You mistake me, Mr. Holmes," she said at last, her composure returning like a veil drawn neatly into place. "What you call a menace is the embryo of a new order. The human animal lives at the mercy of noise, panic, riot, warfare. Give me the note that governs the nerves, and I will give London peace." "Or obedience," Holmes returned, very gently. "There is little to choose between them, save in the conscience of the conductor." She smiled, and I confess I shivered. "Conductors are necessary, Doctor," she added, turning to me with that same cool brightness. "Or orchestras become mobs." Holmes's long fingers, which had been resting idly upon the brass housing, moved hardly at all. Yet I saw, who know his hands as a physician knows the pulse, that something delicate had been accomplished. He had loosened a contact and, I think, pocketed a sliver of wire so fine it might have been a hair. When he spoke again, his tone was all silk. "You have refinements the late Mr. Pelling never achieved," he said. "Rourke provided the hands, you the purse and the theory, but a work of this ambition seldom ends with two signatures whose crest lay blind embossed upon the parchment in Fowler's fist, not yours, Miss Bray." The briefest pause. "Investors," she said. "Men with concerns upon the river, men tired of strikes and theft, they prefer their names kept silent." "Silas Drew, for one," Holmes suggested. "A warehouseman with a grievance against Pelling and an appetite for leverage." Her lashes lowered. "Mr. Drew is a dull man. I employ minds." "Then you will not object," Holmes said pleasantly, "if the Yard confirms your dull acquaintance presently." He inclined his head to Lestrade, whose jaw worked but whose sense, long tutored by Holmes, prevailed over impulse. He went in search of a constable without taking his eyes from Miss Bray. Holmes stepped to the machine, examined a dial with apparent innocence and raised his brows a fraction. "You scheduled a demonstration?" he observed. "See, Watson, this little index. The hand is set to midnight. A visitor promised, no doubt, a purse to be closed. You chose the river because a tone will travel cleanly along water. You chalked the symbol upon your doors to mark the tuned chambers. You sent warnings to Baker Street when the church upset your harmony. You have courage, madam, and a taste for theatre." "Precision, not theatre," she said, though a flush rose and passed. At midnight they would have heard a proof that would bind contracts for years. Holmes's smile did not reach his eyes. "Then keep your appointment, I insist." She lifted her chin. "On what condition?" "Upon this, that you write, in your own clear hand, to Mr. Drew and such other gentlemen as you employ, that the site is changed. You will invite them to St. Jude's Belfry, where acoustics have already proven favourable. You will say that Barnaby's man has found a fault in the warehouse apparatus, and that a finer demonstration will be afforded at the source. The key to your future, you will add, hangs where the city can hear it." He glanced to me. "Watson, oblige Miss Bray with my pocket-case." I opened it. He laid before her a square of stout paper. She hesitated, measuring him. "If I refuse?" Holmes's slender shoulders moved the merest trifle. "Then, madam, I confess I should be compelled to remove a certain governor from your instrument and allow it to address the river at once." The harmonics would not confine themselves to warehouses. You and I might withstand it. The skippers on this reach would not. I dislike extortion, but I dislike drowning men even more. She regarded him with a curious mixture of anger and admiration, then took the pen. Her hand was steady. When she had written, Holmes dried the ink with a breath, scanned the lines, and nodded. Capital. Lestrade will see your notes delivered by trustworthy clerks of my acquaintance. We have 12 hours. In that time I shall make your bell speak one last useful sentence. You mean to use it as a lure, I murmured. As a mirror, he returned. Our adversaries think in straight lines, source to receiver, master to subject. Let them come to the tower, as to a throne room. We shall conduct a different arrangement. Back in Baker Street, the winter light had lowered to a tarnished pewter. Holmes took tea without noticing it and worked at the bench with the rapt economy of a watchmaker. From his pockets came the oddments of the day: iron filings, a pinch of brick dust, a hair of copper, a fold of lavender-stained card. With these and the contents of his chemical drawer, he fashioned a device so modest it looked like a child's toy, a pocket fork whose prongs were crossed by a slip of silver and a crumb of wax, and a coil no larger than a sovereign. "This," he said, "is the parasite I removed from Miss Bray's contrivance. With it I can fetch a ghost note at will, too faint to harm, just bold enough to betray any tuned plate within 50 yards. When the gentleman ascends St. Jude's, we shall know which breast contains the master key." "And Basil?" I asked. "You are certain he is not of their number?" Holmes paused, the point of his knife poised above the coil. "Basil is a reed in the wind, useful to show direction, ruinous to lean upon. He will come tonight because fear pulls him as surely as greed pulls others." "Miss Bray?" I said. "She will come because she must control the thing she worships. Faith is obedience to a note one cannot prove," he added, almost kindly. "So is fanaticism." At 10 o'clock, the fog returned, thick and luminous, muffling the lamps until each became a small moon with a halo. We reached St. Jude's by the north alley, where Keene awaited us with an expression compounded of terror and trust. Lestrade had posted his men at the lane's mouth and in the churchyard beyond, their boots and coffs lost in the woolly dark. Within, the nave glimmered with a handful of candles. The bell above loomed invisible, like a silence with weight. "Everything as we left it?" Holmes asked. "Aye, sir," said Keene. "Only the door to the tower I've kept unbarred, as you said. It goes against the grain." "Courage is the art of keeping one's grain while opening one's door," Holmes murmured. "Now up, Watson. We shall sit where angels might and listen for sinners." We took our station in the gloom of the bell chamber, the ladder hole yawning black at our feet. Holmes settled with his back to the timber frame, the little fork in his palm. Twice he brushed its tine with a fingernail. I felt, more than heard, a whisper in the wood. Far below, a hinge sighed. Footsteps mounted, one set swift and anxious, another measured, another heavy with the assurance money confers. Miss Bray's veil moved first through the lantern shaft, then her face, pale and intent. Behind came Basil, drawn, harried, his eyes burning, and two men whom the river had dressed in good cloth without robbing of their coarseness. Lestrade and a plain-clothes man followed a dozen rungs below, keeping their shadows. "Gentlemen," Miss Bray said softly into the dark, "one last refinement, and you shall hear the city's future." Holmes's hand touched my sleeve. The fork trembled. He leaned, breathed a question so small it might have been a thought. "There," he said,
The second man, the taller, his breast pocket sings when I call. The tuning plate lies over his heart. Silas Drew, if I did not err, had come to collect his empire. Holmes rose into the sparse light as a conjurer steps into his own illusion. I fear, madam, that the future will be delayed, he said very coolly. Inspector, if you please. Drew's hand flew toward his coat. Holmes struck the little fork once, a cat's paw of sound rippling through the timber. The man flinched as if pricked by a needle. His fingers spasmed uselessly and the pistol fell, clattering down the ladder hole into a depth that swallowed it whole. Basil cried out. Lestrade surged up. Men moved in the throat of the stair, and for a moment the chamber became a study in arrested violence. Bodies half committed to flight or fight, all halted by a silence that was suddenly triumphantly ours. Miss Bray looked at Holmes with something like wonder and something like hate. You tuned him, she said. You tuned us all. No, said Holmes. You tuned yourselves. I merely gave the bell back its say. The silence at the top of St. Jude's Tower was no longer the silence of death, but of breath held between two heartbeats. Holmes stood over the bound men, the small tuning fork still vibrating faintly in his hand, a ghost of its own defiance. Drew glared up from the floor, jaw clenched, while Basil Pelling crouched against the bell frame, his face a map of terror and disbelief. Miss Bray had retreated only as far as the ladder hatch, one hand gripping the beam for balance, her eyes fixed upon Holmes as if she might, by force of will alone, undo what he had done. Lestrade's men clambered up behind, their boots clanging on the rungs. Good work, Holmes, the inspector called, breathless but triumphant. We've got them penned proper. Holmes said nothing for a moment. He lowered the fork into his pocket, then turned to Basil. You have something to tell us, I think. You were drawn here as surely as the others, yet you never touched the machine yourself. Basil swallowed hard. I swear I knew nothing of this madness. He pointed at Miss Bray with a trembling hand. She said my uncle's experiments were harmless, that they could make our shipping lines safer, protect men from storm or riot. She said we'd finish his work, not pervert it. Holmes's tone was almost kind. And yet you signed the papers she placed before you, securing the funding and the warehouses under your name. That, my dear sir, is the kind of ignorance the law recognizes as profit. Basil's eyes clouded. I was deceived. Indeed, Holmes murmured. And willingly. He turned sharply to Miss Bray. You played upon his fear and vanity as Pelling once played upon yours. But tell me, Miss Bray, did you truly believe you could command an empire by the ear? Or was this only revenge upon the world that would not listen to you? Her voice came low, steady. The world listens to nothing until it trembles. You, of all men, should understand that, Mr. Holmes. You make people listen through spectacle, deductions, revelations, the theatre of your genius. I sought only to build the same stage, on a grander scale. Holmes inclined his head slightly, though his eyes stayed sharp as drawn wire. Perhaps you flatter me. My instruments are words, not vibrations. They persuade, they do not enslave. A flicker of something crossed her face. Regret, perhaps, or fury, swallowed by reason. He wanted to bury it, she said suddenly. Pelling found a frequency that could still the chaos in men's minds. He called it an accident. I call it salvation. If he had let me finish it, London would have known peace. Lestrade stepped forward, cuffs glinting in his hand. Peace, bought with dead men's ears, miss, is no peace the yard approves. She did not resist as he fastened them about her wrists, only looked once toward the bell above,
as though she were listening to something no one else could hear. "It will find another voice," she whispered. "You can't silence the note forever." Holmes's mouth tightened. Perhaps not. But one can teach it discretion. Down in the nave, the candles burned low, guttering as we descended. The constables led Drew and Basil away under guard. Miss Bray followed between them, her head high, her expression serene. Outside, the fog had thickened again, swallowing the street lamps so that each flame floated in its own small world of light. As they vanished into that yellow mist, Holmes paused on the church steps and drew a deep breath of the cold air. "It is finished," I said quietly. He shook his head. "Hardly. We have silenced an echo, nothing more. The original note, the principle that inspired it, remains in the minds of those who heard it. Some will forget, others will seek to reproduce it. But we have, for the moment, restored the city's equilibrium." We returned to Baker Street through the fog, both of us too weary for words. When at last we sat before the fire, I watched Holmes light his pipe with slow, deliberate care. The blue smoke curled upward, thin as a line of thought. For a long while he studied it without speaking, and the only sound in the room was the steady tick of the clock. "You see, Watson," he said at last, "what terrifies me most is not that she was wrong. It is that she was almost right. There are tones that calm, as there are words that heal. Had she sought harmony instead of dominion, she might have changed the world for the better. But power, even in its gentlest form, corrupts those who mistake order for virtue." He leaned back, eyes half closed, and for once there was a trace of weariness in his voice. "Every invention begins as curiosity and ends as conquest. The scientist forgets that knowledge, like sound, needs silence to survive. I studied him in the firelight. And what of you, Holmes? You pursue knowledge without pause. Do you never fear where it might lead?" He smiled faintly, without opening his eyes. "I fear ignorance far more, but I know when to stop listening." We sat thus for some time. Outside, the city's noises resumed their familiar chorus, the clip of hooves, the cry of a newsboy, the distant murmur of the river, life returning to its imperfect rhythm. Toward midnight there came a soft knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, pale and apologetic. "Beg pardon, Mr. Holmes, but there's a gentleman insisting to see you. Says it's about St. Jude's." Holmes's eyes opened, sharp again. "Show 'em in." A constable stepped inside, hat in hand. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said, "but when we sealed the warehouse by the river, one of our men found this in a crate. Thought it looked like something you'd fancy." He handed over a small metal disc the size of a half-crown, engraved with the same circle and 3 lines. Holmes turned it over once, twice, then placed it upon the mantel where the firelight touched its edges. "A tuning plate," he murmured, "but not one of Miss Bray's make. The workmanship is finer, continental. See here, Watson. The engraving is, inverted, meant for reproduction, not display. Someone pressed these into wax to mark instruments elsewhere." "You mean there are others?" "Undoubtedly. The harmony, as she called it, may have been wider than we guessed. Pelling was not the only dreamer in London." He rose, slipped the disc into an envelope, and sealed it with wax. "For now we let the music sleep. The river will carry its echoes, but not its instructions. And when next it tries to speak, we shall be listening." He crossed to the window. The fog had lifted at last, revealing a faint silver gleam where the first suggestion of dawn touched the rooftops. "Do you hear it, Watson?" he asked softly. "The city?" "The silence before it wakes." He smiled, not without melancholy. "Even silence, my dear fellow, has its own tone, and tonight It is in perfect pitch. The fire crackled. Beyond the glass, London stirred once more, unaware of the thin thread of sound that had nearly rewritten its heart. And in the quiet room at Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen, until the first bell of morning rang clear through the mist. It was 3 nights later when I found Holmes once more at his violin, though the music that floated through our rooms bore none of the haunting tension that usually followed a case. It was soft, restrained, almost wistful. The fire burned low, and the city's hum beyond the curtains was gentle, subdued. It seemed that, for once, London had granted him peace. "You've been uncommonly quiet since St. Jude's," I ventured. "Does the matter trouble you still?" He set down the bow, his long fingers resting lightly upon the strings. "Not trouble, Watson. Reflection. There are certain investigations that conclude with the capture of a culprit, others with the comprehension of a truth. This one, I fear, offered neither in full." I poured 2 cups of tea and handed him one. "You saved lives, Holmes. You prevented Miss Bray's device from spreading madness through the city. Surely that is conclusion enough." He smiled faintly. "Ah, but you mistake cessation for conclusion, my dear fellow." We silenced an echo. We did not find the hand that struck the first note. Pelling's research was far too sophisticated for a solitary mind. In failing health, his equations bore the hand of another, someone with education, resources, and reach. Miss Bray was an idealist, Drew a brute, Basil a fool, but somewhere behind them is a composer we have not yet heard. He rose and crossed to his desk, where the small silver tuning plate lay sealed in its envelope. "The plate is not English make," he continued, turning it over in the lamplight. "German workmanship, perhaps Austrian, precise, mathematical. The inverted engraving shows it was used to mark a series of instruments, not one. I have already sent inquiries to Vienna. If my suspicion is correct, there exists a laboratory devoted entirely to acoustic resonance, a place where men study sound as chemists study fire." I leaned forward. "You believe such experiments continue?" "Unquestionably. Humanity never relinquishes its flirtations with power, even when scorched by them. There will always be another who hears the siren call of control hidden within music. Pelling tried to bury it. Bray tried to free it. The next may perfect it." He fell silent for a moment, his gaze distant. "Still, we have bought the city time. That is sometimes all one can do." A knock interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram. Holmes opened it, scanning its brief message with an unreadable expression before handing it to me. "To Sherlock Holmes, Baker Street, London, concerning your inquiry. Similar frequency experiments recorded at Vienna Conservatory under Dr. Heinrich Schreiber. Departure of Schreiber for England confirmed last month. Destination unknown. L." "Lestrade," I murmured. "Then the thread continues?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Indeed. Schreiber, the name rings faintly. He was once Pelling's correspondent, though their letters ceased years ago. If he has come to England, he will not be idle." He replaced the telegram on the mantel and turned back to the window, where the mist had returned to blur the lamps into halos. "Watson, have you ever noticed that sound and crime share a peculiar kinship? Both are invisible, both rely on vibration, disturbance, and both vanish the instant they are caught. You speak as though the city itself were an instrument." He smiled, and the firelight caught the tired amusement in his eyes. "Perhaps it is. And men like Pelling and Bray fancy themselves its players, but every instrument, however grand, needs tuning. That, my dear friend, is our work, and yours, to record the score faithfully." He took up the violin again, plucking one string with delicate precision. "A case rarely ends as neatly as one desires. Yet I find consolation in imperfection. It means the music continues. The true detective, he added, his tone softening, never seeks applause, only harmony restored, if only for a fleeting bar. He drew the bow across the strings, and a low, rich note filled the room, echoing faintly against the walls before dissolving into quiet.
For a heartbeat, the memory of St. Jude's seemed to stir again. The hum beneath the stones, the bell that spoke without sound. But now it was tamed, mastered by a single human hand. Holmes let the final vibration die, then turned toward me. "Write this one carefully, Watson. Call it The Silence Under St. Jude's, and let it stand as warning enough. There are forces in this world that whisper too sweetly for men to resist. Some secrets," he said, his voice barely above the fire's hiss, "should remain unplayed." Outside, the bells of London began to chime the hour. Their tones rose clear and steady into the night, untouched by any hidden resonance, untainted by any secret science. And as the city's soundscape reasserted its dominion, Holmes leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, listening not for silence now, but for balance. For once, even Baker Street was still. The detective and his chronicler sat together, the world momentarily in tune, the case of the silence under St. Jude's closed, not by victory, but by understanding. And in that quiet, honest, perfect quiet, Holmes's bow fell once more upon the strings, not to summon deduction, but to celebrate what he had preserved, the fragile, priceless music of peace.